Under the hood is a true fire-breathing monster. The only thing this engine has in common with the base Vette engine is the displacement. Both happen to be 5.7 litre V8s.
If the evidence shows scientifically it's not going to damage your automobile, why not?
Motoring 91 is brought to you by Quaker State. The big Q stands for quality. Always has, always will.
Not bad, eh? It's a 1966 Corvette Stingray. Unfortunately, I don't own it, but later on you will meet the owner and find out why this car is so special. And also this week, on Test Drive with Graeme Fletcher, he is going to take a look at the newest in Corvette technology, the brand new ZR1. But first, we're going to begin by joining Karen Horseman at the races. Now, Karen told me that a Corvette owner wouldn't be caught dead in this event. Let's find out why.
If you have a four-wheel drive vehicle, you could be a part of off-road racing. It's a little wild, it's a little dirty, and you have to have some guts. But judging by the interest from across the country, off-road racing could be the sport to watch for in the 90s.
It's the combination of all types of racing put into one. There's drag racing, there's sand drag racing, there's almost mud bogging at times, there's circle track racing, because of the speed that you're doing. It's a combination of all of them put together. And the track is never the same twice.
What is exactly about off-road racing, though, that makes it different than other type of racing?
It's full of action. It never stops. The contact's so close out there with all the trucks. The tracks are tight, and the competition's really good.
It was a wild, muddy, loud afternoon at Brighton Speedway as the 4x4s and dirt buggies took to the track. There aren't many rules in off-road racing, and many of the drivers have a simple strategy.
Yeah, I try to find a hole and finally the guy in front of me push so I can pass right away. Because if he don't move, I have maybe touching, because there was no way I can pass him.
We started with, one night, one race, one night, 1 year. We're now to 3 two-day events, and there's plans for next year of a minimum of 6 events here at Brighton. So it's big and it's growing.
But the question remains, is off-road racing dangerous?
Once in a while we got bruises in the back but on the elbow, but not much. I rolled over in Kitchener 3 years ago above 70 miles per hour and make 4 or 5 big rollover in the air. I got nothing. Only a big bruise on my knee, so nothing.
In my truck, I'm very, very comfortable. The only time that you're going to get into a problem is when somebody shortcuts on safety. And we have an association here which monitors all our safety, your belts, your fire extinguishing system, your brakes, things like that. And that's very, very important.
The rules, they have to be stock body panels. A lot of the suspension has to stay stock. You're not allowed to do too much to the motors. Keeps it very competitive. It's inspected at every race. They go over the whole truck, make sure everything's the same as it was and that it meets all the rules.
Still leading him down, pulls off towards the speedway.
Most of the drivers admit that off-road racing is just a hobby, but there is money to be made.
Basically, it's a sanctioned event and they pay an entry fee. That entry fee, to be exact, 80% gets turned back into a purse, which they get paid at the end of the event. We as promoters supply all the awards, the trophies, and so forth. But the actual prize money, it's the same money that they paid when entering, it gets turned back.
And as the sun sets and the dust settles, trucks and buggies alike take part in the post-race cleansing ritual.
You guys can set the camera down and help.
We don't do windows. Stay tuned. Coming up on Test Drive, we look at a Chevrolet that wouldn't be out of place in a situation like this, the Molson Indy course in Toronto.
If you love a Corvette, you can never have enough of them in your driveway. This is the car I had off the top of the show, the 1966 Corvette Stingray. This you may be more familiar with. This is the 88 version of the Corvette. And joining me right now is the proud owner of both Corvettes, Bill Tripp. And Bill, first of all, you obviously are hooked on Corvettes. When did it all start?
Well, I started driving them at an early age, about 16 years old. I worked for a gentleman that had one of them, and he used to take me out in it, and I used to drive it around. And I bought my first one when I was 17 years old, and I kind of stuck with them ever since.
Tell me a little bit about the 66 here.
Well, the 66 I bought when I was 17, paid approximately about $4,500 for it. It's got a 427 L88 in it, which is kind of a rare motor. There isn't too many of them around, and some of them were rated at over 500 horsepower, and it's a pretty fast car.
The newest Corvette on the road today is the ZR1. What are your thoughts on it?
Well, I drove one. I was able to take it out for a ride. I wasn't really able to take it to the test track or anything like that, but I drove it on the street, and I wasn't really overly impressed with the power source in it. I didn't think it was as fast as it was all hyped up to be. You know, for that kind of money, I thought there'd be more there than there really was.
Well, Bill, stick around, because later on Test Drive, our very own Graeme Fletcher is going to test drive the ZR1. We'll see what he thinks. But first, it's time to head to the shop and join our favorite mechanic, Bill Gardner.
Now, you've probably used many standard sockets and wrenches to service your car, but you've probably found that there's a few areas you need more specialized tools. So this week we're going to have a look at some of those tools. You may have thought that they're too expensive or they don't warrant you purchasing them. But when you look at today's labor costs, you might want to think that one over again. I'm sure that many of these things will pay off in the first or second time you use them, and you'll have them for a lifetime. You'll get a good feeling about being able to repair your own car, too. You're going to run into an awful lot of threaded fluid lines on today's cars that have some pretty tight fittings, and they may be partially seized, too, if they haven't been off in a few years. If you use something like an open-end wrench, you're not going to get a very good grip on that nut, and you'll probably round it off before you get it off. So we're going to use something like a line wrench here, which is basically a box wrench with the tip cut out. And it'll slide right over that fluid line so that we can get that nut off without damaging it. Now, this high pressure power steering hose is one that quite often fails, has to be replaced. Now you can see that that line wrench that we just showed you on the fuel line won't work here because there's just too many obstacles. Even if we could get it on, we couldn't turn it. So we're going to use something called a crowfoot socket, which is a variation of that line wrench. You can see why it's called a crowfoot socket. It snaps right over that nut, and then we can use a standard ratchet and extensions to engage that crowfoot socket and remove the nut. Any number of swivels or adapters will do here. Now, you may be called upon to replace one of these fluid lines that we mentioned earlier, and you can buy prefabricated steel lines with the nuts already on them. But in order to sneak them into the car, you may have to put some significant bends into them. Now, a bend like this in a 1/4-inch steel brake line is fairly easy to make with your hands. But when you get to the larger lines like 5/16 and 3/8 that are used for transmission cooler and fuel lines, those lines are awful stiff. And in order to make a bend in them, you'll have to use a bending tool like this one. It'll make up to a 90-degree bend in that tube without flattening or collapsing the tube. If you tried to do that by hand, you'd kink the tube off and block it. Every once in a while, you'll run into a screw that's in a very difficult to reach location. In that case, a right angle screwdriver like one of these two, this is a straight blade right angle screwdriver, or a Phillips at right angle, will help you get to that fastener without having to disassemble a number of other components. Here's a tool that I find really handy for checking for gasket and seal leaks in an engine. A little telescopic swivel mirror. It's also handy for looking at part numbers on distributors, carburetors, fuel injectors, starters, things like that. It allows you to get a view without removing that component completely. Next week we're going to talk about a really pesky problem with cars, and that's rim leaks, tires that lose air in cold weather. Till next week, I'm Bill Gardner for Motoring 91.
Test Drive with Graeme Fletcher.
We promised you a hot Chevrolet, and this is it. This is the Corvette ZR1, and what differentiates this car from any other Corvette on the road is this. Last season, in testing the Isuzu Impulse, I commented on how I hoped General Motors would take advantage of the engineering excellence they acquired in purchasing Lotus. The ZR1 bears much of the fruit from this acquisition. Under the hood is a true fire-breathing monster. The only thing this engine has in common with the base Vette engine is the displacement. Both happen to be 5.7-litre V8s. At peak RPM, the engine churns out 375 horsepower and 370 pounds-feet of torque. Above the 3000 RPM, the power comes in progressively and strongly, propelling the car to 100 kilometers an hour in just under 5 seconds. The power is relayed to the ZR1's specially designed 315/35 ZR15 tyres through an extremely refined 6-speed transmission. The only annoying trait the transmission has is that under light to moderate acceleration, the transmission actually guides the shifter from first to fourth. While GM suggests this improves fuel economy, from a driver's perspective it's a real pain, forcing you to override it at the most inopportune moments. The driver is truly shoehorned in behind the steering wheel, and so getting in and out requires a lot of practice and patience. However, having negotiated this, the fully articulated seat hugs the driver and provides the support and comfort required when you start to use the car's full potential. The dash is a Mickey Mouse affair that marries digital and analog readouts in a configuration that does neither any favors. The remaining controls fall readily to hand, button after button after button. The ZR1 is definitely not for the meek, so GM might be advised to take a leaf out of the competitor's book and offer an advanced driving course for the purchasers of all ZR1s. Having said that, the ZR1 is surprisingly civilized when driven around town. The ZR1 we tested was a 1990 model. At the time of the test, the only distinguishing features were the squared-off taillights and a tiny ZR1 badge. For whatever reason, all 1991 Vettes will sport the same taillights, leaving the tiny badge the only difference. Having blown the competition away, it might have been nice if they knew what tailpipe they were looking at. I tried the adjustable suspension in all 3 settings during the pylon test. There is a noticeable but not huge difference between the touring, sport and performance modes. I found the middle sport setting to be the best for most driving conditions. It isn't too stiff and you can feel the suspension working, making the car predictable. Having said all of this, there is a fair amount of body flex, especially when the locating bolts for the removable roof come loose. Unfortunately, this occurs on a regular basis. I, for one, would be more than a little hesitant to push the car with the roof removed. The valet key located in the center console is a superb idea. Take the key out and the engine is limited to around 250 horsepower. Pop it in, turn it on and look out. You now have all 375 horses at your beck and call. The key stops over-anxious car jockeys from getting speeding tickets that in Ontario could run you about $1,900. Before the scoreboard, my pet peeve, and on the Vette it's to do with the fact that it doesn't have a locking gas cap. Now, half a pound of sugar in here would do untold damage to the engine, and that on a $75,000 car is just not acceptable. Now to the scoreboard for the final ratings of the ZR1. How much can you say about the ZR1? It is at least as fast, if not faster, than most other exotic cars. If you bite your bottom lip and let it rip, you race through the 100k mark in about 4.5 seconds. 100 miles an hour comes in just under 10 seconds. This is not a car for the meek, or for that matter, a geek. The 3-level suspension setup and mammoth tyres give the Vette phenomenal cornering capabilities. One can only say that it would take a driver of extraordinary talent to push the ZR1 anywhere close to its almost 1G limit. Having motivated 3,500 pounds of automobile to speeds verging on those capable of making the car airborne, it is reassuring to know that the powerful anti-lock brake system can haul you to a halt in a hurry. We recorded stopping distances of around 100 feet from 80 kilometers an hour. We recorded noise levels of 74 decibels, most of which was tyre noise and gear whine from the 6-speed tranny. Fuel economy? Quite simply, who cares? As long as the figure stays on the miles per gallon side and not the gallons per mile. The ZR1 is as good a sports car as you're going to find anywhere. For the dollar, it represents one heck of a good value if you judge value by speed. If the chassis were the equal of the engine, the ZR1 might actually rate a perfect 10.
Generally speaking, if you're in the trade, you're aware of it, but the average consumer isn't really aware that used antifreeze is a hazardous material.
I'm just putting around the neighborhood in this 1966 Corvette Stingray. And you know, when this car first came out, the environment was not a big topic. Thankfully, that has changed. And you know, the automobile industry has done its part in protecting the environment. And here's Steve Grant with another chapter in that story.
Overheating is one of the leading causes of mechanical breakdown in this country, and that's why it's so important to make sure your coolant is in tip-top shape. But what do you do with your old antifreeze once you've flushed out the system? Well, a lot of backyard mechanics and even service station operators just throw it down the sewer. That's where it ends up. And you know where your drinking water comes from.
Generally speaking, if you're in the trade, you're aware of it, but the average consumer isn't really aware that used antifreeze is a hazardous material. Cats are attracted to it, they love it, because it's sweet, it's a sugary flavor, but it'll kill the cat. Antifreeze itself isn't hazardous. It's the dissolved metals that collect in there through constantly running over metal in the engine. So after a couple of years, it's picked up a fair portion of the various metals that are in the engine: aluminum, copper, bronze, iron, and lead. And most people are familiar with the toxic abilities of lead.
If you're still dumping coolant, you're likely breaking the law. All provinces now have severe restrictions on the disposal of hazardous waste. And that leads us to the Mark X Power Flush machine, an engine coolant recycler. It was the law, not conscience, that forced the Win Oil Company to develop the Mark X.
Basically, the machine is a machine that runs on air only, and what it does is designed to take the antifreeze, push the antifreeze out of the car, in the machine, and then put it back into the car. We go through the cycle 3 times, and that treats approximately 95% of the antifreeze.
Once filtration is complete, your new old antifreeze is rejuvenated with an additive package designed to bring performance levels up to or above conventional drain and fill.
I think it's interesting, when we heard earlier today, we were reminded about paper and how recycled paper we kind of thought as second-class stuff a little while ago. Now, you can't tell the difference. It's great, and it's becoming more and more user-friendly. So I think that we have to look upon recycled products, you have to look at the stats that they have, which show that it's just fine. And I think we have to say, hey, we don't need lily white brand new stuff all the time. If this works, if the evidence shows scientifically it's not going to damage your automobile, why not? Why not use it?
The consumer has accepted it very well. You see, he's getting his own antifreeze cleaned up. There's a perception here about recycled products. One of the problems with recycled motor oil is the perception, well, if I put recycled motor oil in my automobile, I don't know where it came from. Where did it originate? Did it originate from a car, a tractor, or whatever? So by actually cleaning up the motorist's own antifreeze, he knows what he bought 2 years ago. He could buy the very best antifreeze on the market because he loves his car. So what he's getting back is exactly that same antifreeze, cleaned up and with an inhibitor package put in.
This is a lot like mum and apple pie. I mean, who could possibly be against a system that protects the environment? But yet there is resistance.
Good afternoon, Plus Brands Canada.
The consumer's being fooled, we believe. He drives away from the servicing dealer thinking that he's got a very clean cooling system, as well as he's been done his part for the environment. Notwithstanding what they've done for the environment, which we think is a good thing to do, his cooling system is not prepared for the upcoming season, whether it be summer or winter.
First Brands is the company that brings us Prestone antifreeze, and it's a company with more than a passing interest in how this new technology will change the way we deal with antifreeze.
What this does is when you're making an antifreeze from scratch, as we do, it's very difficult to get the number of inhibitors you put into that solution to stay in solution. You're hitting with a lot of solids. And during its lifetime, these things can fall out in a normal, useful lifetime. When you put more inhibitors in there, the likelihood of those things those chemicals joining up with other chemicals and getting bigger masses, causing bigger globules. They'll get caught in the radiator, fins, and other cooling channels, cause hot spots and overheating. And typically that's why they call it coolant, is to stop a car from overheating and give good heat transfer.
If our program becomes commonplace, there's going to be a lot less antifreeze sold and used. You take one garage using the machine a couple of times a week, and that's 4 gallons of antifreeze not being consumed. So I see their point. The only thing that and the question I ask myself is, why don't they get into the business too? I would love other people to get into the business because it creates more awareness. We don't want to be the only one out there.
Both Wins and the manufacturer of antifreeze claim that their products work equally well. Still, nobody has decided what to do with this stuff once it's no longer useful. You won't save any money recycling your antifreeze, but at least the alternative is there. Brand new antifreeze or cleaned up coolant. Well, ultimately the decision rests with you.
There's nothing like a nice hot cup of coffee during that drive to work in the morning. The Calypso is developed for those who would rather drink than clean. According to the manufacturers, it's more than a cup holder. It's a magic, incredible drink holder. Hit the brakes, the Calypso bends with your drink. Turn sharply, the Calypso leans with you. Back up, the Calypso doesn't move. It doesn't matter what you drink. This gizmo can handle sloping surfaces up to 40 degrees.
Calypso, go throttle up.
Kenzie's Corner with Jim Kenzie.
This car is equipped with 2 horns. This one and this one. Now the first one is the one that you hear 1 nanosecond after the light turns green, and it's coming from the jerk right behind you. It's a sign of arrogance and impatience, and it's the reason why in a city like Toronto, any use of the horn is interpreted as a fight to the death. The second one is the way you should use your horn. Use it as a warning to children playing on the sidewalk, bicyclists maybe 100 yards down the road ahead of you, or a car backing out of a driveway. Now, if you're the recipient of a horn honk, don't assume the guy wants to fight with you. Assume he's just trying to get your attention. And acknowledge the honk with a wave of your hand. And please, use the entire hand and not just one finger. I'm Jim Kenzie.
That is it for this week. We want to thank Bill Tripp for allowing us to cruise around in this beautiful 1966 Corvette Stingray. We'll see you next week with more stories and more cars on Motoring 91. Make sure you join us.
Motoring 91 is brought to you by Quaker State. The big Q stands for quality. Always has, always will.